Good evening, all. Tonight we are talking about William James's Pragmatism and Ludwig Wittgenstein. So get ready for it. First off, I have to show off my geeky t-shirt. I am wearing a shirt that reads, "It's all Greek to me," in Greek. Okay, anyway. All right, so we're going to start with isms. With William James, we've got a radical empiricism, and that's going to transition into his pragmatism and then finally to his pluralism. Now, all of this is going to make a little more sense in just a bit here, but we start off with a question. Does consciousness exist? This is a big question that James asks, and he says, well, yes and no. If we mean consciousness as this kind of spaceless, massless, but real thing, no, that doesn't exist. But if we think of our conscience as a flow of ideas, that stream of perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, then yes, that absolutely does exist. So how are we going to knit these two things together? Without going back to Aristotle and talking about final causes or really strictly following Darwinian biology, what James is looking at is process tied to function. So larger purposes, larger possibilities beyond our immediate focus. So the real question is, what is the function of consciousness? That is, what purpose does it serve? What does it achieve that could not be achieved in any other way? Now, the brain is a really complex organ. It's got a lot of things going on, and yet it's not just this kind of buzzing, blooming confusion. There's something deeper than that. For survival, not only do we have to be able to sense our external environment, but we've got to be able to react almost instantaneously to external stimuli. In other words, if I see something falling and it's falling towards me, I don't need to stop and think about the need to get out of the way. I just kind of do it. So I've got this hair trigger sort of brain functionality, and that's really one of the things that intrigues William James here. So our conscious, the processes that we declare to be necessary to kind of go through regular mental functioning, we do attention, we pay attention to things, selection, we can choose them, and then finally will, we can decide on them with active reaction to our environment. And so what James develops out of this is what he calls the ideomotor theory. Here's kind of how this works. Think of it as a reflexive control to any sort of stimulus. Most of us have a fight or flight mechanism, or if something is thrown at us, we're either going to try and bat it away, we're going to try and catch it, or we're going to try and move to avoid it, okay? So as these reflexive experiences continue, we start to build up this reservoir of behavior that we can draw on. Or if, for instance, we've been conditioned to stop at octagonal red signs with white outlines and writing on them, then we're going to build that into the reservoir also. By attending to these, we select behavior one versus another. So for James, the will is just part of our nature. And his pragmatism is going to be tied directly to his functionalism because of this. So what is this word I keep using, this pragmatism? The simplest version is, if it works, then it's true. But that's kind of oversimplifying it. James held that the pragmatic method is basically a way of settling metaphysical disputes that would otherwise be totally interminable. So how do I trace each idea to its practical consequences? We could take something, for instance, like the question, does God exist? That is a perfect instance in which we can use our pragmatism, because what does it tie to? What would be the consequences of God existing or God not existing? These are the sorts of questions that James is tying to. I mean, we really can't find good physical evidence, and so we've got to then turn to a metaphysical, a beyond or adjacent to the physical sort of discussion to try and figure this thing out. So a guy named Peirce had earlier given a different version of pragmatism. He says this: consider what effects, which might conceivably have practical bearings, we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then the whole of our conception of those effects is the whole of our conception of the object. Now, that's really needlessly complex. What he's saying is kind of back to the light switch type of thing, okay? So the light switch, we really don't think of as an independent entity. Right there in its name is light. So we know that that switch is just to turn on the lights. If we think of, for instance, an apple peeler, okay, the only purpose that that thing serves is to peel the apple. Okay. Now, could we peel something else with it? Yes. But the idea is we think of the effect rather than the object itself as having an independent existence. So the two views here, they're pretty similar. What they have in common is what we do on behalf of our highest interest. We apply these things practically in order to actually get stuff done and to be functional in the world. So we have to then start to ask, what are our highest interests? Are they different for different people at different times and in different cultures? So we might look at questions of aesthetics. Think of things, and if you're following along, on slide 16, you can see one of the Padang women of Burma who has the brass neck rings that are added to extend the neck. They don't actually make the neck longer. They actually just lower the collarbones, but it gives the effect of a longer neck. And there's also one of the Ubangi women from, I forget which African country, I believe the Congo, with the lip plates in place. These are things that to us may look strange, they may look foreign, they may look different, but are integrally tied to their cultures. If we look at our own traditions here, we might look at various types of fashion that kind of go through of, do we change these things or do we stay the same? My fashion hasn't really changed in the past 15 years, so I don't worry about such things, but a lot of people really do. They want to be on that cutting edge. So this might have one of those effects on are the highest interests different for different people? So for all we know, the universe itself is evolving in such a way that it's in constant flux. We don't really find a static mass where things are not changing. So as we go through this, there's always some broad perspective that replaces an earlier one. Forgive me. If we look into the current situation of sheltering in place from COVID-19 and all that kind of thing, look at how it has changed from we need to stay away from each other to we need to limit it to groups of 10 to we need to not come in contact with people. If you go outside, maintain social distancing, then to wear a mask, then to wear a mask of this level or greater, and so on and so forth. So we've got these broad perspectives that are replacing earlier ones, and it's not going to be the same everywhere. It takes a while to change. And James views this as very similar to the way our consciousness works. In their given context, certain beliefs and attitudes are going to directly fortify and give direction to those specific lives that are being lived. No unifying theory is going to replace this diversity of outlooks. Even with the situation as it is, you're not going to find, oh, that was a good one. You're not going to find that everybody agrees on the best means by which to address the current problem. And we're not going to presuppose some uniformity of what our highest interests are. Some people are looking at this as an opportunity to connect with family. Some people are looking at this as time to catch up on binge watching. I'm using it to do a lot of reading and playing board games and gardening and woodwork. But we find things that, while they may serve our highest interests, aren't necessarily going to be applicable to anyone beyond ourselves or a very small group. Our highest interests as James sees it, they're not necessarily tied to our culture apart from all others. As James would have it, we can't enforce our habits and practices on others, but we can discuss what about our natures and what about the highest interests of nature such as ours might be. Because if we don't have higher interests in common, that becomes problematic too. Because how would we then bring moral claims against groups like the Nazis and the KKK and Al-Qaeda as what is their highest interest? Clearly it's in conflict with our own, or at least it ought to be. Now, James the pluralist is not a relativist of a modern stripe. A relativist would say, well, it's okay for them to practice this, but that goes against our values, so we're not going to practice it. The way that James counters this is with what he calls fallibilism. Fallible means capable of making mistakes. So there's always going to be more to the account than the current version of whatever we've got can include. Truth starts to have that big question mark under it, and where it overlaps with our belief may be kind of limited. We've got to account for that somehow. So what we've got to do is conduct ourselves in such a way as to record what we take to be our highest interests. But the rub is we never know if we have them exactly right, or if we've matched those interests correctly with our actions. There ultimately is no final word for James. So we've just got to accept what there is. So if we contrast this with the positivists, remember that was what we see with Auguste Comte coming through Mill. James took this to mean that we've got to accept, for instance, that there is a religious aspect to life, because credible report points to the existence of one. People do believe in something beyond themselves, by and large, for the most part, in general, Hosepi Topolu, as well as striving to perfect ourselves and going beyond individual souls and bodies. James was fascinated by this religious thing. In fact, one of the books that you might want to add to your reading list, not a bucket book necessarily, but a good book nonetheless, is Varieties of Religious Experience. What James does is goes through and says basically all people in all places at all times in history have had at least some notion that there is something greater than themselves, beyond themselves, and so on. And he was fascinated by this. There are things, though, that we can't claim to finally know or even claim to know at all. A fallibilist doesn't say that there are absolute answers. We're warned to be suspicious of those who claim to have all the final answers with no question whatsoever. And with that, we turn to Ludwig Wittgenstein. This is an interesting character. If you're following along in the notes, on slide 27, you have one of the most famous or infamous pictures of Wittgenstein, where he looks not a little bit like a serial killer, but I can assure you he wasn't. In his philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein answers the question, what is your aim in philosophy? By saying to show the fly the way out of the bottle. And that kind of gives you an idea of the sort of flavor that you're working with here. Wittgenstein, like Nietzsche, sort of expressed himself in these aphoristic ways, almost homiletically. He's almost preaching to you in a certain way and kind of leaving it for others to sort of plumb them for deeper meaning or significance. If he's right, oh, there we go. There are no problems in philosophy. So our problems of knowledge of conduct and governance aren't real, would say Wittgenstein. There really are just misunderstandings and some puzzles, most of it coming out of logic and grammar of the language itself that we use to talk about it. So the only book that was actually published during Wittgenstein's life was titled the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Usually we just call it Tractatus. The problem of knowledge, he says, ultimately is rooted in how do we describe the world, and then how do we link those descriptions in such a way as to find the case at hand, whatever it may be. The case at hand has to be a part of the world because that's the realm in which any and every case occurs. There are no exceptions. Everything that happens, even if it's unknown to us, is taking place in the same world that we share with it. So to state the case is to offer a proposition, a picture of reality. So we might make a proposition like whales are really big. And that's a broad generalization. And yes, some of them are really big, but there are also pygmy whales that are relatively tiny, about the size of me or anyone else. To give the essence of a proposition means I'm giving an essence of a description, and thus the essence of how I understand the world. The limits of my language mean the limits of my knowable world. In other words, at some point, if I can't talk about it, I really can't know it in any final and settled sense. So how is this going to work? In an interesting way. But before we get there, a little bit about Wittgenstein's life. He was born in Vienna, came from a wealthy family. 3 of his 4 brothers committed suicide, and Ludwig himself had lifelong problems with depression and anxiety. He attended college in an engineering program and got interested in mathematics. He moved to Cambridge, where he studied under Bertrand Russell, one of the most influential English philosophers of his time, and got interested specifically in mathematical logic. He served on the Austrian side in World War I, returned to Cambridge, and the Tractatus that I mentioned earlier was actually his doctoral dissertation, for lack of a better way of putting it. And Wittgenstein felt that his Tractatus solved all the non-problems in philosophy, and he dropped all scholarly projects, went back to Austria, and started teaching elementary school. So, mic drop. So, as long as we go into a picture theory, we can tap into the knowledge of another only through the other's introspective reports. And if we were in class together right now, I would probably ask you to picture a whale, because I mentioned one earlier. Now, Are you picturing a bowhead whale or a sperm whale or a blue whale or a gray whale or a pilot whale or any of these other various versions? Really, all you've got to go on is what I describe to you as my whale that I'm picturing. I publicize my knowledge by revealing my pictures to others. So I describe for them what this is. My knowledge as far as my own mental life, it's entirely private. It really can't be corrected by anyone else. In other words, you cannot picture the wrong whale. You picture the one that's right for you or the one that's most familiar to you and so on. So in the wake of Bacon and Newton, Bacon, the central claim of science, what's suitable for scientific inquiry, is what is accessible to our empirical observation. We can see it, taste it, touch it, hear it, smell it, and so on, okay? But if the contents of my mental life are something I have total epistemological control over, and my mental life is filled up with the facts that I've gathered about the external world, well, then I run into that problem of solipsism. Solipsism comes from Descartes, okay? Remember, I think, therefore I am. So I can prove my existence, but you could quite possibly be a figment of my imagination brought on by, Descartes' malignant demon or being a brain in a jar or what have you. So that's problematic. How are we going to get around that? So my problem of knowledge is my own unique knowledge of the external world for Wittgenstein. And so in this received view, Wittgenstein says, this is mistaken. This is based mostly on grammatical errors. And so we've got to play the language game. And the way he does this is he uses what's called the beetle in the box exemplum. So we think of a room with maybe half a dozen persons. Each of them has a small box. No one can see the contents of anyone's box but their own. That's all you've got to go on, okay? When we go around and we ask each person what's in their box, they say beetle. Okay, so Wittgenstein says, if each person had a private language, how could anyone know the meaning of the word beetle in any language but their own? Now, I know we're getting a little weird here, but wait, we're going to take it back. To carry this further, suppose you were alone. Imagine you were the only thinking thing in the universe, and you wanted to identify the contents of the box. How would you do it? What would you call it? Names signify something only to the extent that it's understood of those speaking and being spoken to as standing for the thing signified. Yeesh, that sounds complex. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean something roughly like this. If I am out driving, which I don't want to be, and I come upon a yellow triangle as a sign, I know that it's urging me to caution. If I come upon an octagon that is painted red with white, I know that it's telling me to stop. And any one of a number of these various things, I understand that that's what it stands for, and so I know it. I understand it. But to stand for something, signs have to be related to that by some kind of rule or conventional understanding, okay? In other words, we all have to come together and we agree, okay, red octagon means stop, yellow triangle means be cautious. How do we do this? Adopting conventions is an inherently social act. At some point, someone said, we have to come up with something that signifies for people to stop here. And conventions are part of actual practices in the world. It's impossible to apply a private rule to a private occurrence. You can't even violate the rules of the language game unless there are other players. Okay? So Wittgenstein says our minds are not like black boxes that we alone have access to. How could anyone seeing only something in the box know it to be a beetle without some agreement prior to that as to what is a beetle? If we go back to Thomas Reid, he was one of our Scottish common sense philosophers. Reid would say that if there weren't a natural language, there never could have been an artificial language. So yesterday I was woodworking and I hurt my pinky finger, as you can see here. And I went, like that. That's the natural language. That grimace of pain is natural language. Most of us, when we get hurt, have been taught to say something that's not particularly natural. Ouch. Why do we say this? Well, because it's cooperative. It's expressive content. It tells other people I have done something to hurt myself, and that's just what we've agreed to say. And it varies from language to language to language. It's a language of sounds and facial expressions, intonations, and posture. And Wittgenstein takes a lot of the same position as Thomas Reid had. The natural language of pain is just grimacing, crying, cringing, and so on. And that's not something that we learn. That's just our natural reaction to painful sensations. Artificial conventional forms and signs get grafted onto that. We say, ouch, or I hurt my hand, and so I shake it around. I don't know what that's supposed to do, but that's what we do. We use the sources of our natural language to build and reinforce the shared reality represented by and in our artificial language. Okay? Where there's meaning, there's also got to be social conventions and social practices. So there's this whole discursive history behind every experience by which that experience gains its meaning. Okay? Begins as a public phenomenon and might be internalized some other way only thereafter. So think of some slang terms. If you've ever seen the movie Mean Girls, one of the girls is trying to get fetch as introduced into the language. Said that is so fetch. They go, quit trying to make fetch happen. It's never going to happen. And yet look at some of the words that we've got. Have you yeeted anything? Have you been on fleek? And so on and so forth. Is someone says something, it gets introduced into common practice, and suddenly we've got a new term in the language that has some origin somewhere with some very specific person. Be kind of interested and try and find those. Okay, so the language game is a set of social practices that's not reducible to the experience of any one person, not really confined to their own private mind. Beetle only refers to an object that can be called beetle if we've got a sufficiently shared form of life. Okay, so meaning is socially constructed. It's part of the actual practices of a community. Because philosophy is a search for meaning, a search for truth, a search for rules of conduct, and so on, it's an inevitably social undertaking, and it goes along grammatical, which just means rule-governed forms. Okay, so Wittgenstein calls back Aristotle. Our names for ourselves, baker, Christian, father, child, they're not biological type of things. Gender, though not sex, nationality, morality, the authority and creativity to bring about these identities, this is all socially constructed. National borders don't have a very long history, maybe a couple hundred years in most places. And so the idea that someone right here can be a German and right here has to be Italian or right here has to be Swiss, that's really relatively recent and mostly linguistic more than anything else. So Wittgenstein offers that once we understand this, the fly can find its way out of the bottle or out of the labyrinth. The problem of knowledge now just becomes another part of the language game, becomes a problem of meaning. And what's called for here is a linguistic analysis. We don't necessarily need epistemology or metaphysics. Metaphysics itself is built up linguistically. We have to be able to talk about what we think. So Wittgenstein is interested in this whole thing. And he says, for instance, in his philosophical investigation, which was published posthumously after he had died, think of the tools in a toolbox. There's a hammer, pliers, a saw, a screwdriver, a ruler, a glue pot, nails, and a screw. The function of words are as diverse as the functions of these objects. It's easy to imagine a language consisting only of questions and expressions for answering yes and no. If you think, for instance, about binary, that's basically what it is, ones and zeros. Yes, no, yes, no. And by combining these together in long enough things, we can do computer programming. To imagine a language is to imagine a form of life. So Wittgenstein leaves us with some very interesting things to think about and some very interesting things to kind of practice with. So my challenge to you is think about some of these words that have come into common practice and popular use, and see if you can trace them down as to what they actually mean, where they might have come from, and how they've gained currency with the rest of us. So that is all I've got for you for now. I hope you all have a delightful evening, and I will see you next week.